Hello, my name is Michelle Demir and I'm one of the heritage pioneers of Grand Junction at St Mary Magdalene Church in Paddington. I started researching the history of the Little Venice Basin when I moved back home to this area where I was born and grew up. My mother was born and raised in the region of Venice in Italy and decided to settle in Little Venice in London. So I have a family connection to living by water. This podcast is the first of a series of 3 podcasts, with this first section of the series covering the history of the canal building age. Canals are artificial waterway channels for water conveyance and to service water transport vehicles. The British Canal Network dates back to Roman Britain and was initially used for irrigation and to link rivers. Since the 16th century, rivers became canalised to assist the navigation of barges. The transport network which existed before the canals were built consisted of either coastal shipping, transport along rivers, or horse and cart pulled along unsurfaced roads. These roads would often become muddy and unusable after heavy rain, and because of the small loads they carried, supply of essential commodities was limited. The growing British Empire and new wealth within the country created an increasing demand for products, yet the country's roads were still in a poor state, and raw materials, goods and produce had to be somehow transported as efficiently as possible to and from places of manufacture, ports and markets. The solution was found in water transport. In the 1750s, the 3rd Duke of Bridgewater commissioned engineer James Brindley to build a canal that would connect Runcorn on the River Mersey with Manchester and Lee in northwest England. Funded by the Duke and named the Bridgewater Canal, the waterway opened in 1761 and is considered to be the first canal of the modern era to be built in Britain. The Bridgewater Canal connected coal mines and factories, carried bulk goods like minerals, building materials, timber, foodstuffs, and was a financial success, earning back what had been spent on its construction within just a few years. Its success proved the viability of canal transportation, and within a few years the British Canal Network came into being as the Industrial Revolution demanded a reliable way to transport goods and commodities in large quantities. When the idea of building canals for transport became popular and the first canals proved successful, entrepreneurs recognized that building canals was a promising money-making opportunity. But public support was crucial and meetings were held to convince people that it was a good idea. A canal waterway route construction plan was required by the government, and members of Parliament would debate whether they would allow a canal to be built or not. Numerous canal building factors and competing interests had to be taken into account. These included the agricultural needs of farmers renting land off landlords, the change of use of parts of farmland from agricultural use to industrial use, the channeling of new and redirection of existing irrigation and sewerage systems, the need for bridges to be built over sections of the canal to reconnect major roads and appease disgruntled landowners, and in some cases the need for reservoirs to be built to feed the canal. Also, the rapid buying and selling of shares in the new canal companies even before the canal was built, and competition between canal companies and disputes about tolls. Thus, an Act of Parliament was required before the construction could start, and the Act laid down the rights and responsibilities of all involved. Landowners and businessmen funded the construction of the canals and were shareholders in the canal building and owning companies. Therefore, they received profits from the canal. The canal companies did not own or run fleets of boats, but instead charged private operators tolls to use their canals. From these tolls, they would maintain the canal and provide services to boats, which enabled them to pay back their initial loans. A toll point was a building on the canal where a fee was collected as boats passed. These were situated at strategic points, including busy locks or the transition from one canal company to another, such as the junction of the Paddington Arm of the Grand Junction Canal and the Regent's Canal at Paddington Broadwater. Building a canal was a hard and dirty job that took years to complete. First, the channel had to be dug out and the sides supported by wooden frames so they didn't collapse in on the canal builders. Once the canal had been dug, it had to be lined to make it waterproof so that water didn't soak into the ground. The materials used depended on what was available in the area. Limestone could be used to build the sides, but in many places clay kept the water in the canal, and stone, brick and wood were used to build the canal locks and bridges. As canals use water draining down from a high point to a low point and then an outflow, so the need for water to fill the canal had to be balanced against the irrigation required by surrounding farmlands. Canal locks had to be built to allow barges and narrowboats to travel to different levels on a waterway route, from highlands to lowlands. Water can only move downhill, not back up again, and every time a lock is used, thousands of litres of waters are moved lower down the canal waterway route. If there is not a good water supply or paddles on the lock gates are left open, this can result in there not being enough water for boats to pass through the locks and travel on to their destination. Finally, the newly constructed canal was filled with water from nearby rivers, streams and reservoirs, with the agreement of landowners and government officials after all the competing needs had been taken into account. Canal owners were prevented from owning their own fleets to prevent a monopoly developing, so another group of entrepreneurs sprung up to provide barges. Barges were either owned and operated by individuals or by companies who would own a fleet of barges and would pay a helmsman a wage depending on the distance travelled and the amount of cargo carried. In the early days of the canal transportation age, from about 1740, all barges were towed by horse, mule, pony, or sometimes a pair of donkeys, along a towpath constructed alongside the canal, where the animals would walk along. This horse-drawn system was standard across the British Canal Network. Canal barges could carry 30 tons a time with only one horse or donkey pulling. That was more than 10 times the amount of cargo per horse than was possible by horse and cart on a road. There were many types of boats on the canal. Larger boats, such as open barges, were designed to carry as much bulky cargo as possible, and these were the workhorse of the canal network and played a key part in the economic changes of the British Industrial Revolution. Gradually, a wider variety of boats were used, including flyers that carried passengers, luggage, mail and parcels, and narrowboats that were designed for narrow canals such as the Grand Junction Canal. For the first era of British canals in the 19th century, crews were all male and were often migrant Irish navvies. Some workers involved in the construction of the canal later became boatmen when it was finished, and several generations of boatmen worked specific stretches of the canal. The traditional crew was master and mate, and if money was short, the mate might be a wife or child. The rear portion of the narrow boat became the boatman's cabin, familiar nowadays from picture postcards and famous for space-saving ingenuity. Of course, made attractive by a warm stove, steaming kettle, gleaming brass, fancy lace, painted housewares and plates. Families often lived in cottages in close-knit, self-contained communities on the canal side. At first, the distances involved were small enough for boatmen to live on the land, canal side. As distances travelled increased, it became necessary to sleep overnight on the barge, and boatmen would often be away for several weeks at a time. As canals started to suffer competition from the burgeoning railway system, increasingly families, especially those of independent single boat owners, began to live on board. This was partly because they could not afford cottage rents on the canal side, partly to provide extra hands to work the boats, and partly to keep families together. However, not all canal companies permitted this. As late as 1858, an article in Household Words, a weekly magazine edited by Charles Dickens, stated that the Grand Junction Canal Company did not allow boatmen's families on board. Idyllic depictions rarely considered the discomfort of boat people working long, hard days and sleeping in one tiny cabin. Canal boatmen had a poorly paid existence, delivering iron, steel, roadstones, coal for boilers, timber, cement, sand, hay, straw, animal produce, and fruits and vegetables cultivated by large market gardens. And they took away rubbish. Local authorities had their own fleets of barges to collect rubbish. Time was important, for the crews were paid by the tonnage, and the quicker they arrived to unload and upload, the quicker they could return for another load. Bringing up families in tiny narrowboat cabins was a struggle, and it is unsurprising, considering the dangerous nature of the trade, that there was a high rate of mortality, particularly among children. Life aboard a narrowboat made it impossible for the children to attend school, so most boat people were illiterate and ostracised by those living on the canal side, who often considered themselves superior. The boat people were often marginalised from land-based society, their itinerant lifestyle also making access to medical help and religion particularly difficult. However, they did receive help and care from churches and charitable individuals. In 1816, a boatman's chapel with schoolrooms was built in Praed Street, Paddington, on grounds leased by the Grand Junction Canal Company. It was a beacon where children could be left for weeks at a time to receive rudimentary education, while their parents carried loads up and down the Grand Junction Canal Network. This brings me to the end of part 1, focusing generally on the construction of canals and the way of life of boatmen and their families. The following part 2 focuses on the Paddington Arm of the Grand Junction Canal and the Regent's Canal, that together form a canal junction in North Paddington.